The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and humidity. Virginia summers never forgive anyone, not even a veteran. My shoes hit the marble floor in even rhythm as I walked toward the front row. Each step sounded louder than it should have, like the echo of something unfinished. I wore my navy dress blues for the first time in 3 years. The sleeve of my left arm, though polished and pressed, still carried a faint brown stain near the cuff, a memory I had never managed to wash out. People say uniforms should be spotless, but some truths are not meant to be cleaned. I could feel the weight of every stare as I crossed the aisle. The courtroom was crowded that morning, though it was only a property hearing. Some came out of curiosity, others because small towns like Portsmouth live for gossip. I did not look at them. My eyes stayed fixed on the judge's bench until movement on my left caught my attention. My father was sitting with his lawyer gray suit white hair combed with the same precision he once demanded from me. His mouth curled before he spoke. A short, dry laugh escaped him. It was not surprise or humor. It was recognition, the sound of someone who had already decided what I was worth. My mother sat beside him, clutching her purse in both hands. When she saw me, she shook her head slowly, as if I had walked into church wearing combat boots. Her lips moved, and I could almost read the words. She never learns. I stood straighter, my chin raised by reflex more than pride. The metals on my chest caught the thin morning light filtering through the tall windows. I heard whispers ripple through the benches behind me. Somewhere, a phone camera clicked, quickly silenced by the bailiff's glare. I stopped a few feet from the plaintiff's table. My father looked me up and down, eyes settling on the sleeve. "Still playing soldier, are we?" he muttered loud enough for me to hear. I did not answer. The judge had entered. Judge Walter Hensley, 62, carried the posture of someone who had spent decades in both military and law. His voice filled the room without effort. "This is case number 4821B, Reeves versus Reeves. The matter concerns disputed inheritance of the Reeves residence on Hawthorne Lane." My father's lawyer straightened his tie and began speaking. The words blurred together, something about maintenance neglect and family responsibility. I listened but heard nothing. My focus stayed on my sleeve. The dried stain near the cuff had turned a muted rust color over time. Most people would never notice it. My father had. I saw his smirk widen each time his eyes drifted toward it. Judge Hensley's tone shifted slightly when he read my name aloud from the file. "Commander Dana Reeves, U.S. Navy, retired." He paused. I saw his brow lift. "Are you indeed the same Commander Reeves commended for actions in Al Raqqa, Syria, March 2020? The courtroom grew silent. I met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." For a moment, the judge seemed to forget the papers in front of him. His voice softened. "My God, is that really you?" The sentence carried no disbelief, only recognition. He had seen the headline once, maybe the after-action report, "No civilian ever reads." He knew what the stain meant. My father's laugh came again, sharper this time. "She loves an audience," he said. "Don't let the medals fool you. She ran out on her own family." A low murmur rippled through the spectators. The judge's eyes hardened. "Mr. Reeves, you will speak only when addressed." My father shrugged, but said nothing. My mother kept her eyes on the floor. I took a slow breath. Every instinct from 20 years in uniform told me to stand still, stay composed, control the breathing, control the voice. I felt the fabric under my fingers rough where the stain had dried into the weave. That blood was mine, and not mine alone. It belonged to the men who had not made it home. "I came here to finish what they started," I said quietly, though not to anyone in particular. The words were barely above a whisper, but the sound carried. My father stopped smiling for the first time. Outside, thunder rolled far away across the bay. The humidity thickened, pressing against the glass panes like a warning. Somewhere deep inside, I could still hear the sharp crack from that day in Syria, the blast that changed everything. The echo lived inside that sleeve, sealed into the fabric like a scar you could never quite hide. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Commander Reeves," he said carefully, "we will begin shortly. Do you require counsel?" "No, Your Honor," I replied. "I have everything I need right here." I touched the folder in my hand, though I was not referring to it. The room held its breath. In the reflection of the polished bench, I saw my father leaning toward my mother, whispering again, confident, dismissive, the same as always. For years, he had taught me that silence was obedience. He never understood that silence could also be a weapon. The bailiff called for order, and the sound of the gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber like a starting gun. That was the moment the story truly began. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia in the summer of 1982, the year my father opened his small mechanic shop on the corner of Granby Street. He named it Reeves Automotive, painted in bold navy letters across a corrugated metal sign. Every morning, he smelled of motor oil and tobacco. Every night, he came home with grease still clinging under his nails. My mother, Martha, taught Sunday school at the small Baptist church near the naval base. She was the kind of woman who ironed napkins and prayed for patience. My father prayed for control. He wasn't cruel in the way people imagine. He was the kind of man who believed in rules more than people. His world was built on what he could fix and what he could order. I was his first and only child, a girl he wanted to mold into quiet obedience. When I asked to help him in the shop, he handed me a broom instead of a wrench. When I scored high in math and science, he told me I was getting too smart for my own good. My mother just smiled in the kitchen and said, "He means he's proud." But I knew better even at 12. Pride in his language always meant control. Every Sunday afternoon after church, he would watch the military jets take off from Naval Station Norfolk, his eyes following them until they vanished over the water. He'd shake his head and say, "Those boys are brave, but they never last." I didn't understand what he meant until years later, until I became one of those boys he never imagined could be me. At 17, a recruiter visited my high school. He wore crisp blues and carried a calm confidence that caught my attention. He talked about service honor teamwork, the things I'd been searching for but never found at home. I took the brochure, folded it into my notebook, and hid it under my mattress. When my father found it 2 weeks later, he slammed it onto the kitchen table. "You think this is a joke? You think wearing a uniform makes you a hero?" I tried to explain that I wanted to study engineering through the Navy ROTC program at Old Dominion University. It wasn't rebellion. It was purpose. "No man will marry a soldier," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a verdict. "You'll end up alone like one of those women who forget they're women." My mother said nothing. She looked down at her hands as if prayer could undo what had already been spoken. The night I left for orientation, he didn't come to the door. He just turned up the volume on the television and said to no one, "She'll be back once reality hits." Reality did hit. It hit hard. The first time I stood on the training field at Great Lakes, I was surrounded by shouts, orders, and the sound of boots slamming pavement in rhythm. The instructors were merciless, but their rules made sense. They didn't care if you were male or female. They cared if you endured. I learned to push past the pain, to function without sleep, to find calm in chaos. By 25, after years of physical training and psychological tests, I entered Basic Underwater Demolition (SEAL) Training Bud S. People called it impossible. They were right. It was designed to break you. The Pacific water at Coronado was always cold no matter the season. It bit through skin like glass. We crawled through sand until our elbows bled, carried boats over our heads until our shoulders burned, and ran until the world tilted sideways. I saw men stronger than I'd ever be crumble in silence. Some left on stretchers, some just didn't come back from the surf. I stayed. During Hell Week, I hallucinated from exhaustion. I remember crawling through mud, hearing my father's voice in the dark. "You'll never make it." The next morning, when the instructors announced that I had passed, I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief that I'd proved him wrong, even if he never knew. At 26, I graduated as one of the few women to complete that pipeline. They handed me a Trident pin and shook my hand. My father never called. My mother sent a postcard that said, "Proud but worried." I kept it in my locker until it faded. Service life became my refuge. It was simple in its clarity, mission team survival. There were no unspoken expectations, no cold silences at dinner tables. Just purpose. For the next decade, I served quietly. Logistics extractions, convoy coordination, nothing glamorous but vital. My team trusted me. We moved people out of hell and into safety. That was enough. Until Syria 2019. Our unit was stationed near Al Raqqa, coordinating civilian evacuations in a hostile zone. I was 32. The desert heat was unbearable, and the air carried dust that stung the lungs. We had been there 6 weeks when it happened. The convoy ahead hit an improvised explosive device. The explosion turned dawn into chaos. I remember the flash, the shockwave slamming me into the side of a transport, the taste of iron in my mouth. I crawled toward the noise, my left arm, useless blood soaking into my sleeve. Through the smoke, I saw Jason Cole, my second in command, dragging another man from the wreckage. Jason had been with me since Coronado. He was the one who once told me during training, "If you ever go down, I'll bring you home." He didn't make it back. When we reached the extraction point, I was half-conscious, gripping the radio with the only good hand I had left. I don't remember passing out, only waking up in the medical tent 3 days later with my arm wrapped tight and the news that 3 of ours were gone, Jason among them. The surgeon said the shrapnel had nearly severed my artery. He didn't know how I survived. I told him it was because Jason had promised, and some promises keep themselves. The uniform I wore that day was soaked in dust and blood, mine his and the kind you can't separate. I refused to let the crew wash it before I was airlifted out. I folded it myself and kept it sealed in my duffel. That same stain, faded and rust-colored now, is what rests on my sleeve today. People think it's a mark of carelessness. It's not. It's proof. When I came home the following year, limping, the sunlight of Virginia Beach felt foreign. My knee ached with every step, and the pension check didn't make the silence any easier. I bought a small house near the shoreline, white siding, peeling paint. It was quiet there. Too quiet. One evening I drove back to Norfolk. I told myself it was just to see the old neighborhood, but I knew I wanted something more. Closure, maybe. My father was in the driveway when I arrived, tuning an engine with his sleeves rolled up. The smell of oil hit me like memory. He turned, wiped his hands, and froze. "Well," he said finally, "you're back." His tone wasn't joy or relief. It was resignation, like I'd just proven his prophecy. I took a slow breath. "I came to tell you I'm out, medically retired." He looked at the limp in my step, the scars on my arm. "So they broke you after all." That was the moment I realized nothing I ever did would change what he saw when he looked at me. My mother came to the door, hesitant. "Your room's the same," she said. "You can stay a while." I looked past her into the house. The photos on the wall hadn't changed: wedding pictures, baby pictures, none of me in uniform. It felt like a museum curated to erase the last 20 years. "No," I said softly. "I'm just passing through." As I turned to leave, my father muttered, "You brought shame, not pride." I didn't answer. The car door shut louder than I intended. That was the last time I saw them before the summons arrived. For 3 years, I lived quietly in Virginia Beach. Mornings started with the sound of waves against the seawall and ended with the low hum of the television I never turned on. I adopted a German shepherd from a rescue shelter, named him Ranger. He was missing part of his right ear, limped slightly on cold days, and hated fireworks. We understood each other. At night, when the pain in my leg flared, I'd sit on the porch with Ranger beside me and trace the scar on my arm under the sleeve. It was rough, uneven, a reminder of the day everything changed. The uniform hung in my closet, the stain still visible under certain light. Sometimes I caught myself staring at it and whispering, "You made it home, Jason." He had once said, "Honor doesn't end when the applause stops." I didn't understand it then. Now I did. It meant living through what others couldn't even when no one was clapping. When the news came in June of 2023, a plain envelope with the county seal, I thought it was a mistake. Property division. Reeves versus Reeves. I had not spoken to them in 4 years. I had paid the property taxes on my grandfather's land quietly every year since his death. That land had been his pride, 47 acres of farmhouse, and the flagpole where he raised the same flag every morning after he came back from Okinawa in 1946. He'd told me once, "If you take care of the wood, it'll take care of you." He left it to me in his will. My father knew it. My mother knew it. But paper means little when bitterness wants to rewrite bloodlines. I sat at the kitchen table staring at that letter until the coffee went cold. Ranger nudged my leg, sensing the tension. The words blurred on the page: petition to transfer ownership on grounds of abandonment. Abandonment. The word hit harder than any explosion ever did. That was the same word my father used when I enlisted at 18. You're abandoning this family. 23 years later, he found a way to make it legal. I looked at the uniform in the closet, at the sleeves still marked by dried blood. I thought about Jason, about the promise, about every mile I had walked to be seen not as a mistake, but as a soldier who served. If they wanted a fight, they would get one, but not with anger, with truth. The morning the envelope arrived, the air over Virginia Beach felt heavy with salt and summer. Ranger was asleep under the table, his paws twitching through some dream only dogs remember. The mail slid through the slot like a blade of paper, soft but final. A cream-colored envelope with a red county seal. I thought it was another veteran's notice or a tax statement until I saw the words printed in bold at the top: Portsmouth County Court. Notice of civil action. My name sat below it in stark black ink. Defendant Commander Dana Reeves, retire. I slit the envelope open with the edge of a knife, careful though my hand was already trembling. Inside was the summons. Case number 4821B. Reeves versus Reeves. Plaintiff Harold and Martha Reeves. For a moment, I could only stare. The sound of the ceiling fan above me faded into a low hum. I read it again slower because disbelief needs repetition to take root. They were suing me for the family property, 47 acres of land, and the old farmhouse my grandfather, Colonel Edward Reeves, had built after the Second World War. The official cause: abandonment of property. I let out a short laugh, the kind that doesn't sound human. The paper shook in my hand. Abandonment. The same word he'd thrown at me half a lifetime ago now pressed into legal ink. I sat down at the kitchen table, the light coming through the blinds in sharp slats. Ranger lifted his head, ears perked. I read the petition in full. They claimed the property had fallen into neglect, that they had maintained the taxes and upkeep since I departed without communication. Lies written clean and orderly. My name printed beneath the accusation like it was already guilty. The house they wanted was not just land, it was legacy. My grandfather built it with the precision of a man who'd survived 2 oceans. Every beam and nail carried a story. He'd planted an oak tree by the porch and raised a flag every morning from the same pole he brought home from Pearl Harbor. I'd watched him do it as a child, his hand steady, his voice low as he recited words I didn't yet understand for those who didn't come home. That flag had become my compass long before I ever wore a uniform. When he passed, the will was simple: the property to his granddaughter, Dana Reeves. He'd written it in pen, not typed, his signature shaky but clear. He told me once, this house should belong to someone who knows what service costs. My father knew about the will. He never challenged it until now. I called the clerk's office. The woman on the line was polite but detached. Yes, ma'am, the plaintiffs filed 3 weeks ago. Hearing scheduled for August 3rd. Do I need an attorney? I asked. You can represent yourself, Commander, but it's advised you seek counsel. The plaintiffs are represented by a Mr. Paul Henshaw. I know him, I said before I could stop myself. Paul Henshaw was a local lawyer, the kind who handled small-town disputes, property lines, inheritances, family grudges. He'd been my father's drinking buddy for decades. I thanked the clerk and hung up. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the clock tick on the wall. Ranger came to my side, pressing his head against my knee. I rested my hand on his back, steadying my breathing. My parents hadn't called when I came home from Syria with a limp. They hadn't written when I retired from service. They'd never once visited, and now the first message they sent in years carried a seal instead of a signature. I stood up and walked to the cabinet where I kept my service files. I pulled out a thin folder marked Estate, Cor E. Reeves. Inside were copies of the will, the tax receipts, the transfer confirmations I'd paid every year since 2012. My name printed clean across every document. I'd done it quietly because honor didn't need witnesses. I placed the papers on the table beside the summons. The contrast made me laugh again, softer this time. 2 stories written in the same county, one by blood, one by law. One true, one desperate. That evening, as the sun lowered over the Atlantic, I called an old number from memory. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Hanley here. Mark, I said. It's Dana. There was a pause. Reeves. Damn, it's been years. You still breathing? Barely, I said. I've got a situation. I explained everything. The lawsuit, the accusation, the irony of being charged with abandonment by the very people who'd left me behind. He listened without interrupting. They want the house, he said finally, because it's yours. They always wanted control, I replied. You have proof of payment every year since Grandpa died. Then you don't need me, he said. But I'll tell you what I told one of my clients last year. Go there yourself. Don't hide behind paperwork. Let them see what they erased. I leaned back in the chair. You really think I should? You've faced worse than a courthouse, he said. Sometimes standing still is the loudest thing you can do. His words lingered long after the call ended. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black no sugar. The taste was bitter grounding. Ranger watched me from the doorway. They think I abandoned them, I told him quietly, but they were the ones who left first. The next morning, I drove out to the old property. The road was still cracked and lined with pines. When I turned the corner, the farmhouse came into view, a ghost of itself. The paint had peeled, the porch sagged, and the oak tree my grandfather planted stood half dead. The flagpole was still there, though the flag had torn to threads. My father's truck sat in the drive. I parked on the opposite shoulder and watched him through the windshield. He was laughing with a neighbor beer in hand, telling some story loud enough for me to read his mouth. He saw me eventually, but didn't wave. He just stared, the smirk rising like it always did. The same look he gave me when I left for training. The same look he gave me when I came home limping. My mother stepped out onto the porch wearing her apron, a watering can in hand. She looked older, smaller somehow. When her eyes met mine, she froze. Then she turned away and watered the same wilted flowers again, as if repetition could undo recognition. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there until the light shifted and the crickets started singing. Then I drove away without a word. That night, I pulled out the old Navy chest from the back of my closet. It was the same one I'd kept since Coronado. The metal hinges creaked when I opened it. Inside lay the things that had defined 20 years of my life, a folded flag. My trident, a stack of commendations, and at the bottom, the dress blues I hadn't touched since the day I left the service. I lifted the jacket carefully. The fabric still smelled faintly of salt and sand, the faint rust mark still visible near the cuff. Underneath it lay a sealed envelope, one I hadn't opened in years. I knew what was inside before I unfolded it. Jason Cole's last letter. The handwriting was hurried but steady. Honor doesn't end when they stop clapping. It ends when you stop standing tall. I read it 3 times. The first to remember his voice, the second to feel the weight of his absence, and the third to understand what he'd meant. Standing tall wasn't about medals or courts or even forgiveness. It was about refusing to bow when the world called you less than what you knew you were. I refolded the letter, placed it back in the chest, and laid the jacket over it. My reflection in the mirror caught the faint sheen of the metals dulled with time, but not forgotten. For years I'd avoided wearing it because I thought peace meant moving on. But some wounds don't heal by hiding them. Some heal only when you stop pretending they're not there. The next morning I stood in front of the mirror wearing the uniform again. The fabric felt heavier than I remembered. I buttoned each piece, slowly adjusting the collar, pinning the ribbons in perfect alignment. My left sleeve brushed against my skin, stiff where the stain had set. I didn't try to hide it. Not this time. I looked at my reflection. Older, wiser, still standing. I thought about what Mark had said. Go there yourself. Let them see what they erased. So I would. I placed the summons, the receipts, and the letter from Jason into a folder. Ranger followed me as I locked the door. He barked once low and certain, as if giving an order. I smiled. I'll be back, partner. The drive to Portsmouth took less than an hour. The city felt smaller than I remembered, the streets lined with the same brick buildings that had watched me grow up. When I passed the diner where my father used to take me for Sunday pancakes, I could almost hear his laugh echoing across time, the same laugh that used to make me feel safe, now hollow with memory. I parked near the courthouse and sat for a long time with the engine off. The world outside moved in slow rhythm, people walking, cars passing, the flag above the courthouse snapping in the wind. I traced the edge of the summons with my thumb, thinking about how every fight in my life had led to this moment. Not a battlefield, not a rescue, not a convoy under fire, just a room where truth had to speak louder than pride. Before I stepped out, I touched the blood-stained sleeve once more. "You'll see me now," I whispered, not to them but to every ghost who ever doubted I'd stand again. The heat hit like a wave when I opened the door. The courthouse loomed ahead, columns tall and weathered. The air smelled of salt and asphalt. I walked up the steps slowly, the sound of my shoes steady and deliberate. Each footfall felt like reclaiming something that had been taken piece by piece over the years. Inside, the clerk handed me the case docket and told me the hearing time. "You'll be in courtroom B," she said. "Judge Hensley presiding." I thanked her and turned to leave, but she stopped me. "Commander Reeves." "Yes." She hesitated, eyes drifting to my sleeve. "Thank you for your service." I nodded once. Words felt too small for what needed saying. Back in the car, I sat with the folder in my lap. The air was thick, the kind that carries both tension and promise. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought about the house, the porch, the oak tree, the flagpole standing like a spine against the sky. I remembered my grandfather's voice, low and steady. "Every board's got a story, Dana. Take care of it." This was mine. As the sun dipped behind the courthouse roof, I whispered what I hadn't said in years. "I'm not running anymore." The faint echo of surf from the bay reached even here, steady and endless. I started the engine. The case was set for the following week. I had 7 days to prepare, 7 days to remember who I was before they tried to make me forget. In the mirror, my eyes looked the same as they did the day I enlisted, focused, unshaken. "Honor doesn't end when they stop clapping," I murmured again. Jason's words filling the silence. "It ends when you stop standing tall." And I wasn't done standing yet. The week before the hearing stretched long and slow, the kind of days that feel heavy even when the air is still. I woke before sunrise each morning out of habit more than need and sat on the porch with coffee cooling in my hands. The sky over Virginia Beach was the same color it had been in every deployment, dawn steel gray fading to pale gold. I watched the waves form and collapse, and I thought about the courtroom waiting just days away. For most people, court was where family matters ended. For me, it would be where mine began again. Inside, the house was quiet. The uniform hung on the back of the chair where I'd left it, dark blue wool catching the faint morning light. The stain on the left sleeve was small now, just a brown whisper against the fabric, but it carried more history than any of the medals above it. I laid it flat on the table and began cleaning the brass buttons one by one. The metal polish left a faint citrus smell that clung to my hands. Each click of the cloth against metal reminded me of the nights before inspection when we'd sit in the barracks polishing until our fingers cramped the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above us. Clean uniform, clear conscience, the instructors used to say. Every thread was supposed to speak discipline, but this time I didn't want perfection. I wanted truth. I wanted them to see that the uniform was not just a costume. It was a ledger of everything I'd survived. I spread out the ribbons next, checking for dust. Silver Star Navy Commendation Medal, Combat Action Ribbon. I pinned each one with the precision drilled into me over years of repetition, but my hands trembled slightly when I touched the Silver Star. It wasn't the medal itself, it was the memory behind it. That day in Syria when the convoy went down, when Jason Cole refused to leave the wounded behind, when the world went white and red at the same time. The blood that soaked my sleeve that morning was the same that dried there still. In training, they'd tell us that blood on your uniform was a violation, a reminder of failure to control the battlefield. But there were things you couldn't control. I'd kept the stain not as defiance but as a record, a truth you could touch. The morning light grew stronger. I took a step back and looked at the jacket. It was immaculate except for that one mark, like a confession written into the cloth. The rest gleamed ribbons, straight collar, crisp boots, polished to black glass. I ran my hand over the sleeve and whispered, "You'll stay." By afternoon, I drove into town to gather a few last documents, the will copy, the tax records, the property ledger. The clerk at the courthouse handed me the forms with a practiced smile. "Big case?" she asked, glancing at the name. "Family," I said. That was enough explanation. Driving home, I passed the old neighborhood. I hadn't planned to stop, but memory pulls harder than reason. The roads were narrower than I remembered, lined with maples bending over the asphalt like they were trying to hide it. The Reeves house stood at the end of the street, same white siding, same sagging porch, same cracked driveway where I'd learned to ride a bike. Time had peeled away the paint, but not the patterns of habit. My father was in the yard talking with the neighbor, Mr. Dorsey, the same man who used to lend me his dog when I was little, because my father wouldn't let me have one. They were laughing about something, and even from across the street, I could tell the story was about me. My father's laugh had a sharpness to it, the same one he used when mocking anything he didn't understand. I rolled the window down just enough to catch his voice. "She left that house to rot," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. "Never lifted a finger for it. Some soldier she turned out to be." Mr. Dorsey gave a polite chuckle, the kind of sound people make when they want to stay on your good side. My father continued louder now. "I told her years ago duty's not the same as family. Guess she proved me right." The words didn't sting like they used to. They just felt tired, like echoes of a script he couldn't stop reciting. My mother appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron just as she always did. She bent to adjust the flowers by the steps petunias, this time pink and white. Even from the car, I could see the way she moved, carefully arranging the petals like apologies that never reached my ears. The flagpole by the roof was still there, though the flag had long since torn. It hung in faded threads tangled around the pole, flapping weakly in the breeze. My grandfather had raised that flag every morning without fail. Rain or shine, he'd stand at attention and lift it, slow, his hand steady as his breath. He taught me to salute before I could even spell the word. Seeing it now tattered and forgotten felt like a betrayal deeper than the lawsuit. "He taught me to raise it," I whispered, watching the fabric twist in the wind. They let it rot. I started the car again. My father turned at the sound, but didn't recognize the vehicle. For a moment, I almost wanted to step out to ask him why he couldn't just let the past rest. But some silences are more powerful than confrontation. I drove away, leaving the image of the sagging house behind in the rearview mirror. That evening, I returned home to find the light fading through the blinds, the air cool from the sea breeze. I set the uniform back on the hanger and stood in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back was both familiar and foreign. The scar on my temple, the streak of gray near my temple, the faint lines around my eyes, all small evidences of time's quiet discipline. I put on the jacket, buttoning it slowly. The weight settled across my shoulders like an old friend. I practiced walking across the room, back straight steps measured. The sound of my boots on the wooden floor echoed through the empty house. Ranger watched from his bed, his eyes following me. I stopped in front of the mirror again and lifted my left arm. The sleeve caught the light just enough to make the stain visible. It wasn't dark anymore, just a faint shadow, but it was there. I traced it with my finger and asked aloud, "Will they even see the cost behind it?" Ranger made a soft noise, almost like a sigh. I smiled faintly. "Didn't think so." I spent the rest of the night reviewing my documents, marking each page with notes, receipts, and copies. Organization had always been a soldier's comfort, everything in its place, everything accounted for. Yet no matter how neat the folders looked, they couldn't capture what this case really meant. This wasn't about land. It was about erasure, about reclaiming something they'd tried to write me out of. At midnight, unable to sleep, I went out to the porch. The moon hung low over the water, pale and distant. The air smelled of salt and honeysuckle. I closed my eyes and listened to the tide. Somewhere in the distance, a ship horn sounded a long, lonely note that carried across the bay. It reminded me of deployments of nights spent waiting for dawn in places where dawn meant survival. I thought of Jason Cole again, of his letter folded in my chest. Honor doesn't end when they stop clapping. He'd written that before we went into Al Raqqa. Back then, I thought he meant medals. Now I knew better. It meant moments like this, quiet defiance standing tall even when no one was watching. The next morning, I woke early. I shaved, tied my hair, neatly polished the boots again. The ritual steadied me. Each movement was deliberate, controlled. That's what service had taught me. When emotion threatens to undo, you find precision. By noon, I decided to drive once more past the old house, not out of sentiment, but strategy. I needed to see it again before facing it in words. When I turned down Hawthorne Lane, the light hit the roof in sharp streaks. The oak tree in front, once grand and proud, was splitting down the middle hollow in the trunk. It looked like something fighting to stay upright out of habit. My father was nowhere in sight this time. My mother knelt by the porch trimming dead leaves. She didn't see me. I watched her for a while, remembering the nights when I'd sit beside her shelling peas while she hummed hymns under her breath. Those songs used to feel like safety. Now they sounded like denial. The flag still hung in tatters. I thought about getting out and raising it properly just once, but stopped myself. Some symbols have to wait for the right time. Driving away, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. That night, I laid out everything on the table: the uniform, the file folder, the letter, and a small compass my grandfather had given me when I turned 16. It had belonged to him during the war, brass worn smooth around the edges. He'd told me, when you lose your way, find north. Even if you can't move, you'll know where you're facing. I turned the compass over in my palm. The needle pointed steady. North. I placed it beside the folder. Before bed, I rehearsed the walk again, slow-controlled, deliberate. The same gait I'd used entering the command tent in Syria after the blast, pretending I wasn't shaking. I practiced the moment I would stand before the judge. No fidgeting, no nerves, no anger. Just quiet truth. The mirror reflected the uniform under lamplight. The metals caught faint glimmers. The sleeve hung still, that small patch of brown, blending with the fabric like time had signed its name there. I whispered to the empty room. They'll see it now, whether they want to or not. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of the convoy again, the flash, the dust, the ringing in my ears. But this time, when I looked down, the blood on my sleeve didn't scare me. It glowed faintly in the dark, not as guilt, but as remembrance. When dawn came, I felt calm. The decision was made. As I stood by the window, watching the first light touch the ocean, I thought of my father's words years ago: duty's not the same as family. He was right, but not in the way he meant. Family was supposed to be duty, protecting what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The hearing was in 2 days. I ironed the uniform one final time, careful not to touch the sleeve. The house smelled faintly of starch and sea breeze. Ranger sat by the door, tail thumping softly. "Time to finish this," I said. When I packed the car that afternoon, I paused one last time at the threshold. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. I touched the compass in my pocket, felt the cool brass against my skin. The needle was still pointing north. Outside, the air shimmered with heat, the sound of cicadas rising like static. I locked the door and slid the keys into my pocket. The next drive to Portsmouth would not be reconnaissance. It would be battle. Not one of bullets or commands, but of patience and truth. In the rear-view mirror, the ocean flashed once a strip of light that looked almost like a metal-catching sun. I smiled slightly and whispered, "Standing tall, Jason." The road ahead was empty, waiting. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of heavy heat only Virginia knows, humid, slow, and thick enough to feel like a warning. The courthouse on High Street stood tall against the sunlight, its white columns casting long shadows across the brick steps. People moved in and out of the building in a quiet rhythm, shoes tapping against marble papers, rustling like whispers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and dust. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, matching the pulse in my temples. I stood at the base of the stairs for a long moment, looking up at the double doors. The last time I'd faced a briefing room this quiet, I was waiting for orders in Al Raqqa. Only this time, there were no weapons, no enemy soldiers, just bloodlines sharpened into legal edges. I adjusted my collar, felt the weight of the metal settle across my chest, and took a slow breath. The uniform fit tighter now, time having claimed what youth once lent. The sleeve brushed against my wrist, stiff from the faint trace of the stain that never washed out. The doors ahead gleamed in the sunlight. I could see my reflection in them: straight shoulders, steady eyes, the reflection of a woman who had fought harder for truth than for survival. Then I pushed them open. The echo of my boots struck marble, tap, tap, tap. Every head turned. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried cutting through the low murmur like a metronome of discipline. Rows of benches lined the courtroom filled with strangers, reporters, curious locals, maybe veterans who'd heard about the case. But near the front in the plaintiff's section sat my parents. My father turned first. His gray hair was slicked back, his hands resting on his knees. When he saw me, his mouth curled into a smirk. "She's actually wearing it," he muttered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. Laughter, brief and uncomfortable, rippled from the benches behind him. My mother kept her head down, twisting her wedding ring, slowly eyes fixed on the floor. I stopped at the defense table and set my folder down. The bailiff, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, glanced at me and straightened unconsciously. "All rise," he called out as Judge Walter Hensley entered from the side door. The judge was in his early 60s, his hair silver at the temples, his posture still carrying the sharpness of military bearing. The navy crest pin on his lapel caught the light as he sat. "Be seated," he said. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades in both courtrooms and command tents. He looked down at the docket. "Case number 4821B, Reeves versus Reeves." He paused, glancing at me, his gaze catching on the uniform. His eyes narrowed not in disapproval, but in recognition. "Commander Reeves," I stood. "Yes, Your Honor." The faintest flicker of surprise crossed his face. I thought I recognized the name. "You served with Task Force Delta during Al Raqqa." "Yes, sir." He nodded once quietly. "Understood. Proceed." Paul Henshaw, my father's lawyer, stood next. He was broad-shouldered, his voice trained in the art of polite aggression. "Your Honor, my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, are the rightful custodians of the Reeves family property. They have maintained and paid the taxes for over 4 years, during which the defendant has been absent from both the family and the premises. The property has suffered from neglect and mismanagement." He paused, letting the words settle. "They are simply asking for what they've already been responsible for." The judge nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Henshaw." "Ms. Reeves, Commander." I corrected not out of pride, but precision. Henshaw's jaw tightened. My father gave a short derisive snort from his seat. "Commander," he repeated under his breath. That title died when she ran from home. The sound carried farther than he realized. The room grew still. Judge Hensley's eyes lifted from his notes, sharp as a blade. "Mr. Reeves, you will refrain from commentary unless addressed by the court." My father leaned back, but didn't look ashamed. His smirk lingered like oil on water. I opened the folder slowly and laid out the documents one by one on the table before me. "Your Honor, these are the tax payment receipts for the property paid annually under my name since 2012. Attached are the transaction confirmations the inheritance transfer signed by Colonel Edward Reeves and the official will recognized by Portsmouth County the year of his passing." I handed the set to the clerk who brought them to the bench. The judge began flipping through the pages, the sound of paper crisp in the silence, his brow furrowed, eyes moving between signatures and stamps. After a moment, he looked up. "These are legitimate documents, verified through both state and federal channels." He turned to Henshaw. "Were you aware of these, counsel?" Henshaw cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my clients were under the impression that those payments were drawn from a shared family account I cut in calm and steady. The payments were made through my military pension. The receipts show that clearly." Henshaw's tone hardened. "Commander Reeves, you've been absent from the property for several years. Would you call that responsible stewardship?" I met his gaze. "Would you call suing your daughter stewardship?" A murmur spread through the benches. The judge lifted a hand for silence. "Let's keep this civil," he said quietly, though the ghost of a smile touched his eyes. He returned to the documents. "Commander Reeves, can you confirm the authenticity of these signatures?" "Yes, Your Honor. I was present when my grandfather drafted the will. He served as colonel under the U.S. Army Pacific Theater during World War II. The house was his post-war property." Judge Hensley nodded slowly. "I knew of Colonel Reeves," he said. "A good man. Served with distinction in Okinawa. He'd be proud of that service continuing." My father shifted in his seat, muttering something about sentimental nonsense. The judge heard him. "Mr. Reeves," he said, voice suddenly colder, "this court recognizes service. It's not nonsense. It's sacrifice." For the first time, my father looked unsettled. his lips pressed tight, his hands clenched in his lap. I kept my expression neutral. Years in uniform had taught me the strength of silence. Henshaw recovered first, clearing his throat again. Your Honor, even if these payments are legitimate, it doesn't change the fact that Commander Reeves abandoned the family home. The word abandoned struck the air like a slap. I straightened, voice quiet but cutting. I didn't abandon it. I preserved it. While they sold off his tools, cut down the oak he planted, and let the flag rot on the roof, I kept the taxes paid so that house wouldn't end up condemned. That's not abandonment. That's duty. A faint murmur of approval rippled from somewhere in the back row. The judge didn't stop it this time. He leaned forward. Counselor, I've reviewed the county inspection photos. The property isn't neglected, it's aged. There's a difference. Henshaw hesitated, glancing at my father. Your Honor, we still maintain that. Enough, the judge said, his tone firm. Let's be clear about what's happening here. A veteran who served this country is being sued by her own family for property left to her by another veteran. That's the reality before me. Silence fell again, the kind that feels heavier than noise. I could feel the sweat gathering at the base of my neck beneath the collar, the weight of the silver star pressing against my chest. The light from the window cut across the bench and glinted off the metal. My father noticed it. His eyes narrowed. He spoke again, lower this time, but not low enough. She wears that thing like it means something. Maybe it did once. Judge Hensley's gaze snapped to him. Mr. Reeves, he said, voice sharp enough to draw blood. This woman saved 27 lives under direct enemy fire in Al Raqqa. That's not maybe. That's a matter of record. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Henshaw looked surprised. The judge's voice softened slightly as he turned back to me. You don't need to speak on that, Commander. I've read the citation. I nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. My father sank back, jaw clenched. My mother's hands shook as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended and quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the air vent, the rustle of paper, the distant sound of traffic outside. Then, something inside me shifted, a memory pushing up through years of discipline, the smell of smoke, the flash of light, the sand turning black with ash, Jason shouting my name over the roar of an explosion, the metallic tang of blood hot and heavy in the air. My own hand pressing against a wound, red seeping through my sleeve. The same sleeve that brushed my skin, now stiff with memory. I blinked once, steadying myself. The courtroom came back into focus, the judge's calm expression, the clerk's pen poised my parents frozen in disbelief. Commander Reeves. Judge Hensley said softly, Do you wish to submit any further evidence or testimony? I shook my head. No, sir. The documents speak for themselves. He studied me for a long moment. Understood. He turned to the plaintiffs. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, do you have any additional witnesses? My father's jaw flexed. No, he said finally. Then we'll recess for 15 minutes before I make my ruling. The judge said, rising. Court is adjourned until then. The gavel struck once. As the room began to stir, I exhaled slowly. My hands were steady, but my pulse thrummed like a drumbeat in my ears. I gathered my papers and sat eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table. It reminded me of the farmhouse porch, of the way my grandfather used to sand it smooth every spring. He'd told me once, the truth doesn't need shouting, it just needs to stand. Behind me, I heard my father's voice low and angry. You've humiliated this family. I didn't turn. No, I said quietly. I reminded it. He made a sound, half laugh, half growl, but didn't answer. My mother's whisper followed soft and cracking. Harold, please. The bailiff called for order as people shuffled out. A few strangers gave me small nods as they passed, silent gestures of recognition, of gratitude. I didn't need words. When the room was nearly empty, I rose and walked toward the window. Outside, sunlight hit the courthouse steps in bright streaks. The flagpole out front stood straight, the fabric snapping in the wind. I thought again of the one at the house torn and forgotten and wondered if anyone would ever raise it again. The 15 minutes passed slowly. When the bailiff called everyone back in, I returned to my seat. The judge entered, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke. Having reviewed the submitted evidence, this court finds no grounds to support the plaintiff's claim of abandonment. The property in question remains under the legal ownership of Commander Dana Reeves as stipulated by the will of Colonel Edward Reeves. The sound of his gavel striking wood echoed like thunder. I didn't smile. I didn't move. I simply stood, the weight of years lifting without ceremony. The courtroom murmured around me. My father rose halfway red-faced, his mouth opening to protest, but the bailiff stepped forward. "Sit down, sir." He hesitated, then lowered himself back into the chair. My mother began to cry quietly, her shoulders shaking. Judge Hensley looked directly at me. "Commander, you have this court's respect, and my personal thanks for your service." I nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor." As I turned to leave, I felt the eyes of the room following me. The reporters, the onlookers, my parents sitting small in their seats. I didn't meet any of their gazes. I simply walked. The echo of my boots filled the chamber again. Tap, tap, tap. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. I paused on the steps, breathing in the thick summer air. The sleeve brushed my wrist, the faint texture of the stain still there, rough against the smooth wool. I looked down at it and thought, he chuckled when he saw my uniform. Now the world saw the truth written on its sleeve. The courthouse flag fluttered high above its colors, bright against the blue sky. For a long moment I stood there, the city moving quietly around me, and whispered, standing tall. When the court reconvened that afternoon, the air inside the room had shifted. The light through the tall windows was harsher now, the kind that sharpens everything it touches, faces metal truth. The benches were full again, the murmurs louder this time. Someone had leaked the case to a local reporter, and whispers about the veteran versus her family had begun to spread. A quiet storm was gathering, and I could feel its pulse beneath the marble floor. Judge Hensley entered with the same calm authority, but his tone carried a new gravity when he spoke. "Before I deliver the ruling," he said, "the court has been made aware of a supplemental exhibit submitted this morning, Defense Exhibit D, labeled Operational Footage Al Raqqa 2019. He looked at me. "Commander Reeves, do you confirm this submission?" I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. It's the official body cam footage from my last deployment. It was recorded by Lieutenant Jason Cole, my second in command, and released to me posthumously after declassification last year." Henshaw rose instantly. "Your Honor, we object to the inclusion of combat footage in a property dispute. It's irrelevant." The judge cut him off with a single look. "Relevance will be determined here, Counselor. Sit down." Henshaw sat. My father's expression twisted between confusion and annoyance. My mother's fingers gripped her handbag so tightly her knuckles whitened. The judge gestured toward the clerk. "Play the footage." The lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life. The image that flickered onto the screen was shaky, grainy dust and fire filling the frame. The audio crackled with static and adrenaline. The voice of Jason Cole came through breathless. "We've got wounded Reeves, take point." The camera jolted as the operator moved through smoke. The footage showed flashes of light, the roar of another explosion, and then clear as day, me dragging a wounded Marine through the debris, yelling for cover. My left arm was bleeding uniform-torn blood, splattering against the lens. The chaos of war filled the room, screams, gunfire, and above it all, the voice of command, calm but strained. "Move! Keep moving." Then the camera fell, capturing the sky above the desert orange and gray. The last sound was Jason's voice. "We're clear. She's hit, but she's still standing." Silence followed, the kind that felt sacred. The room seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the projector stopped, and for a long moment, no one moved. The image froze on the final frame, me bloodied, standing among wreckage, eyes fixed forward. My father's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. My mother covered her face, a sound escaping her that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The judge leaned back, removing his glasses. His expression was unreadable, but his voice when it came was steady and low. "This," he said, gesturing toward the screen, "isn't abandonment. This is sacrifice." The words hung in the air like a verdict long overdue. He looked directly at my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, your petition claims that your daughter neglected her family and heritage. What I see is a woman who bled for it." No one spoke. The weight of that sentence seemed to press down on every seat in the room. My father's hands clenched on his knees. "That doesn't change what she did to us," he muttered, barely audible. Judge Hensley heard him anyway. "No, Mr. Reeves. It changes everything about who she is." He turned to me. "Commander Reeves, the court recognizes your service and the authenticity of your submission. The evidence establishes both legal and moral continuity of care for the property in question. Therefore, the petition is denied. Ownership of the Reeves estate remains under your rightful name." He reached for the gavel. "Case closed." The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like an explosion. Sharp, final. For a second, I didn't move. I just stood there, the reality sinking in heavier than expected. Not triumph, something quieter. Relief mixed with sorrow like a wound closing around a scar. The benches erupted in low murmurs. Someone in the back clapped once before stopping, unsure if it was appropriate. The bailiff's voice rose, calling for order. My father shot up from his seat. "You can't just sit down, sir," the bailiff said firmly, stepping closer. "I'm her father," he shouted. "That house!" "Sit down," the bailiff repeated louder this time. He froze his mouth, trembling, then sank back down, defeated. My mother sat beside him, tears running silently down her cheeks. She didn't look at me. The judge stood gathering his papers. Before he exited, he looked back toward me. "Commander, sometimes justice looks like paperwork, but every now and then it looks exactly like this. Dismissed." The door closed behind him, leaving a hush that felt like the aftermath of a storm. I collected my folder, sliding each document back into place. The motion was automatic, ritualistic. The courtroom lights flickered back to brightness, washing away the ghostly glow of the battlefield still hovering in the air. As I turned to leave, my father's voice came again, hoarse and cracking. "You made fools of us." I stopped, but didn't look back. "No," I said quietly. "You did that when you forgot who raised the flag first." Then I walked toward the doors. The click of my heels against marble was the only sound. Tap, tap, tap. Each step felt lighter, as though the years of silence, guilt, and exile had been peeled away. The crowd parted wordlessly. A few people, strangers, nodded to me as I passed. One older man in a veteran's cap whispered, "Damn proud of you, ma'am." Outside, the afternoon sun hit hard sharp against the polished glass of parked cars and courthouse windows. I paused on the steps, closing my eyes for a breath. The sound of traffic and distant gulls folded into the background, and for a moment all I could hear was the faint echo of Jason's voice. "She's still standing." I looked down at the sleeve. The faint brown mark caught the sunlight just enough to glimmer. It wasn't shame. It wasn't defiance. It was the truth written in fabric. He had chuckled when he saw my uniform this morning, mocked the weight of it, the meaning behind it. But now, the same room that once judged me had witnessed what it cost to wear it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mark Hanley. "Saw the news. They finally saw what you carried." I didn't reply. Some things didn't need answers. I descended the courthouse steps slowly, each footstep measured, deliberate. The American flag above the building fluttered in the wind, clean whole, the opposite of the one that hung torn over my father's house. I thought about that flag, about the promise it once held, about how easily people forget the price behind its colors. The air was heavy again, but this time it didn't press, it lifted. The tension of years released in one long exhale. I stopped halfway down the stairs and turned slightly, looking back through the courthouse doors. Through the glass, I could see my father still sitting, shoulders slumped, face buried in his hands. My mother leaned toward him, whispering something, but he didn't respond. For the first time, he looked smaller than I remembered. Human, fragile, mortal. It should have felt satisfying. Instead, it just felt necessary. The news crew had gathered by the sidewalk, microphones and cameras ready. Someone called my name, asking for a comment. I ignored them and kept walking. The story they wanted wasn't mine anymore. At the base of the steps, a group of bystanders watched quietly. One man, maybe in his 70s, with a faded Navy tattoo on his arm, saluted as I passed. I paused and returned it. His eyes were glassy when he lowered his hand. "You did right, Commander," he said softly. "Just did what I had to," I replied. Ranger was waiting in the car, head popping up the moment he saw me. His tail thumped against the seat as I opened the door. I smiled faintly. running my hand over his fur. "We're going home," I said. As I pulled onto the road, the courthouse grew smaller in the mirror. The sunlight caught the roofline, turning it gold for a brief moment, before the trees swallowed it. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and asphalt. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the side mirror, the uniform still crisp, the stain still visible, the eyes still steady. I thought about the judge's words echoing in my mind. "This isn't abandonment, this is sacrifice." That line would follow me for years, not because it justified me, but because it reminded me what truth sounds like when finally spoken aloud. Back on the highway, the miles unwound under the tires. The closer I got to the coast, the lighter the air felt. By the time I reached Virginia Beach, the sun was lowering the horizon, burning orange and red. I parked by the boardwalk and got out. Ranger jumped down beside me, trotting ahead. The ocean stretched wide and endless, the wind carrying salt and memory. I took off my cap and let the breeze move through my hair. A few people stared. Uniforms tend to do that, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt visible in a way that didn't hurt. I walked to the edge of the water, the waves lapping against my boots. The reflection of the sun turned the wet sand to gold. I crouched down and ran my hand through the foam. The ocean always brought me back to center. I thought about Jason, about my grandfather, about all the men and women who never got to come home to fight smaller wars like this one. And I thought about my parents sitting in that courtroom watching the truth they'd buried rise up before them undeniable. He chuckled when he saw my uniform, I whispered to the wind. Now the world saw the truth written on its sleeve. The tide moved in, erasing my footprints one by one. Ranger nudged my arm, impatient. I smiled, standing, brushing the sand from my knee. "Let's go home, buddy." As we turned back toward the car, the last light of day caught the sleeve once more. It glowed faintly, almost like a reflection of that moment in the footage, the part where I was still standing, still moving, even when everything around me burned. For the first time in years, the stain didn't feel like something I had to explain. It just felt like part of the story. And I finally understood that standing tall didn't always mean standing proud. Sometimes it meant standing visible, unhidden, unashamed, and unbroken. Have you ever been mocked for standing up for yourself only to prove everyone wrong in public? The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy in the car, even with the windows down. The courthouse had disappeared behind me miles ago, but the echo of the gavel still lingered in my head. Ranger lay curled on the passenger seat, his nose resting on his paws, the rise and fall of his chest steady against the rhythm of the road. The late afternoon light filtered through the windshield in soft gold, catching the dust motes in the air. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely in my lap. My sleeve brushed the steering column, the faint texture of the old blood, rough against the smooth wool. I looked at it again, the small brown stain that had outlived war grief and judgment. It was quieter now, less accusation, more reminder. When I stopped at a red light near the edge of the city, I caught my reflection in the side mirror. The uniform looked sharp under the sunlight, but my eyes betrayed me. They weren't triumphant. They were tired, the kind of tired that doesn't sleep off. I parked by the beach before heading home. The wind was stronger there, the salt cutting through the thick air. Ranger jumped out of the car, tail wagging, sniffing at the sand as if the world had never known conflict. I sat on the hood, watching the horizon where the water met the fading light. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like release, the slow exhale after holding your breath for too many years. The phone in my pocket buzzed once, then again. Messages, dozens of them, piling up like waves. I unlocked the screen. The first was from Mark Hanley News, just broke. They ran the story on Channel 8. "Proud of you, Dana." The next few came from names I hadn't seen in years. Fellow SEALs officers, medics, a few civilians who had been there in the same dust and fire. Screenshots, headlines, and short notes filled the feed. "Former SEAL wins legal battle against parents," the local headline read. Beneath it, a grainy still from the courtroom, me standing in uniform, head highlight catching the silver star. The subheading said, "Court recognizes sacrifice over abandonment." The article was already spreading. Another outlet added, "Al Raqqa hero reclaims family legacy." My phone buzzed again, the messages streaming faster. We saw the clip. "You stood taller than any of us that day." You made every one of us proud, Commander. You carried it home. Each one felt like a hand on my shoulder, solid understanding, yet each also deepened the hollow inside me. I scrolled through them until the screen blurred. Winning isn't peace. It's just quiet. That thought came unbidden, sharp and true. The kind of truth you only realize when the applause fades and all that's left is your own breathing. The sun was dipping low when I drove the rest of the way home. The road twisted along the coastline, the light breaking through the clouds in shards. The ocean glimmered on my right, vast and endless. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered on automatically. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just outgrown its loneliness. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. Ranger patted in behind me, circling twice before settling in his usual spot by the door. I hung the uniform jacket over the chair and loosened my collar. The silence was total. Even the clock on the wall seemed hesitant to tick. On the kitchen table lay the summons envelope, the same one that had started everything. The edges were creased now, the ink smudged from my hands. I stared at it for a long time, then struck a match. The flame flared quick and bright, licking the paper until it curled in on itself. The smell of burning ink filled the room. I dropped the remains into the sink and watched the ashes dissolve under the tap. No ceremony, no speech, just quiet. I took the uniform jacket next and laid it flat across the table. My fingers moved over each metal one last time, tracing the edges, the raised stars, the tiny engraved letters. When I reached the sleeve, I stopped. The faint brown stain caught the kitchen light, soft but visible. I thought about washing it, about finally letting it go. My hand hovered over the fabric, but I couldn't do it. That mark wasn't burden anymore. It was a truth, and truths don't wash out. I folded the jacket neatly, the way I had been taught years ago. Precise corners, perfect lines. I placed it inside the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the same one that held Jason's letter. When I opened the lid, the smell of salt and age rose up, carrying memories with it. I slipped the uniform in, resting my hand briefly on top before closing it. Rest now, I whispered, unsure if I was talking to the jacket to Jason or to myself. Later, I sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee staring into the dark. The air was cool, the wind soft against my face. Ranger sat beside me, his head resting on my leg. He nudged my hand once, then licked the edge of my sleeve, the same sleeve. The touch startled me at first, then softened into something almost symbolic. Healing comes in small gestures, not grand declarations. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's television was tuned to the local news. I could hear the anchor's voice drifting faintly through the night. Today, a retired Navy SEAL won her case in Portsmouth County Court. Commander Dana Reeves, who served with distinction in Syria, successfully defended her legal right to her late grandfather's property. The rest faded into static. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth settle in. Recognition didn't matter. Justice didn't feel like triumph. It felt like breath. My phone buzzed again this time with a voicemail. The caller ID made me pause. Private number. I pressed play. It was my mother's voice, soft, trembling. Dana, it's me. I don't know what to say. I saw the video. I didn't know, honey. I didn't know what you went through. Your father. He's quiet now. He hasn't said a word since. Just take care of yourself, please. The message ended with a long silence before the line clicked off. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for what couldn't be rebuilt. I saved the voicemail anyway. Not out of forgiveness, but because it was proof that truth once seen leaves a mark just as permanent as the one on my sleeve. The following morning, I woke early. The ocean outside the window was silver under the dawn, the surface smooth and endless. Ranger barked once, reminding me it was breakfast time. I laughed quietly, the first real laugh in months. I made coffee, fed him, and sat by the window reading the newspaper that had been left on the porch. My story was on the front page again, a larger photo this time. The headline read, "Truth on her sleeve, SEAL's silent stand inspires nation." I shook my head, half in disbelief, half in resignation. The media always needed a narrative, and I had become one. I folded the paper and set it aside. What mattered wasn't in print. It was in the quiet that finally filled the spaces where fear used to live. That afternoon, I walked down to the beach again. The wind had picked up, carrying bits of sand that stung lightly against my skin. I watched the waves rolling in relentless patience. Ranger chased the foam and barked at the gulls, his joy uncomplicated. A group of teenagers ran past laughing. One of them slowed when he noticed me. "Hey, aren't you the lady from the news?" he asked. "I guess so," I said, smiling faintly. He nodded. "My granddad says you're a hero." "Your granddad sounds like a good man," I replied. "He was in Vietnam," the boy said proudly. "Says people like you remind him that not all battles are fought overseas." I didn't know what to say to that. I just knotted my throat tight. "Tell him thank you for his service." When they ran off, I stood there for a long time, letting the tide wash over my boots. The horizon was endless, the color between blue and gray. I thought about the word home and how it had shifted over the years. Once it was a house in Norfolk. Then it was a base in Syria. Now it was just this, a place where the air didn't demand anything of me. By evening, the sky had turned the color of rust and ash, the same shades that haunted the footage from Al Raqqa. I sat on the porch steps as the first stars appeared. The sound of crickets filled the spaces between breaths. I opened my phone one last time before bed. Another message from an unknown number. This one was a text. Dad saw the news. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry. He doesn't know how to say it himself. Mom. I stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then I typed back 2 words. Take care. I didn't send it for closure. I sent it so the silence wouldn't feel like war anymore. That night I dreamed of the desert. But this time there was no fire, no screams. Just the sound of wind over the dunes and Jason's voice, distant but calm. You made it home. When I woke, the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, soft and golden. Ranger stretched beside the bed, yawning loudly. The house felt lighter, as if it had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. I stood, walked to the cedar chest, and rested my hand on the lid. We made it home, I said aloud. Outside, the flag on the porch stirred faintly in the breeze. I hadn't replaced the old one from my grandfather's property yet, but I would. Not because it was expected, but because it was time. As the coffee brewed, I thought about what the judge had said. Sometimes justice looks like paperwork, but every now and then it looks exactly like this. He was right. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a woman sitting alone in a quiet kitchen drinking coffee while the world outside finally stopped calling her a disappointment. Ranger trotted over and nudged my leg again, insistent. I smiled. All right. Walk time." We stepped out into the morning light. The ocean breeze carried the faint scent of salt and something else, hope, maybe. The neighborhood was waking up, distant laughter echoing down the street. I looked down at Ranger, who was staring up at me with patient eyes. "You know I said maybe peace isn't a place. Maybe it's just the sound of your own footsteps when no one's chasing you anymore." He wagged his tail as if he understood. As we walked toward the beach, I felt the warmth of the sun against my back, the cool air on my face. The world felt vast again, and for the first time in years, I let it. Behind me in the house, the uniform rested folded in the chest, still unwashed, still true. Because dignity leaves stains, the world should see. By November, the air along the Virginia coast had turned brittle and gray. The last of the autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalks like dry confessions. It had been 3 months since the verdict, long enough for the noise to fade, but not long enough for peace to feel normal. The news cycle had moved on, the veterans' forums had quieted, and I had learned the rhythm of stillness again. I spent my mornings fixing small things around the house, hinges, fences, the leaky faucet that had driven me mad all summer. The kind of repairs that didn't need to be done but kept my hands busy. Some afternoons I'd take Ranger to the beach, throw a stick until he tired himself out, then sit with my feet in the cold surf and watch the horizon dissolve into fog. The days were quiet, predictable, almost gentle. Until the knock came. It was a cold Thursday afternoon, the kind that smelled of rain. I had just poured myself coffee when I heard it 3 knocks, deliberate and heavy. Ranger barked once, low and uncertain. I opened the door, expecting a delivery, maybe the neighbor. Instead, my father stood there. He looked smaller than I remembered. The man who used to fill a doorway now seemed swallowed by it. His left arm was in a sling, the cuff of his flannel shirt frayed. Grease still marked his fingertips, but his eyes, those hard blue eyes that once ruled every room, looked dimmed. "Dana," he said quietly. His voice carried no authority, only fatigue. I said nothing. He hesitated, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I had an accident at the shop. Nothing serious. Just a cracked rib, a few stitches." He paused, glancing down. "Your mother's been sick. Real sick. We need help." The words hung between us, trembling like a wire ready to snap. I stepped aside just enough for him to see the kitchen, but not enough to invite him in. "Coffee?" I asked, not because I cared, but because silence demanded something to fill it. He nodded once, unsure if it was permission. I turned, poured a second mug, and set it on the table. He entered slowly, glancing around like the house itself might accuse him. His boots squeaked faintly on the floor. Ranger watched him from the doorway, tail still hackles raised. He took the coffee in both hands but didn't drink. "I know you hate me," he said finally. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I don't hate you." He looked up, surprised. "I stopped giving you that much power years ago," I said. He nodded as if expecting the blow. I deserved that. The clock ticked once. Rain began tapping lightly on the window. "I'm not here for me," he said after a moment. "Your mother, she's got pneumonia. I'm not asking for money, just she'd like to see you, before things get worse." I stared at the steam rising from my cup. The smell of coffee, familiar and grounding, mixed with something I didn't want to name. Old pity, maybe. "You didn't need me when you sued me," I said slowly. "You don't need me now." His face tightened. He nodded again, swallowing something that looked like pride turned sour. "I know. You're right. I just thought—" He stopped, words collapsing under their own weight. The silence stretched long. I took a slow sip, the bitterness cutting through the moment. "What happened at the shop?" I asked, mostly to break the quiet. Lift collapsed. "My fault." He rubbed his good hand over his face. "I wasn't paying attention. Guess I've been distracted." "Guilt does that," I said softly. He didn't argue. His eyes stayed fixed on the tabletop. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain. Finally, he said it. The sentence I never thought I'd hear. "I just wanted control." His voice cracked on the last word. "You gave me shame." I looked at him, then really looked. The man who had once sneered at my uniform, laughed in a courtroom, and called my medals decoration, now sat hunched, defeated, a shadow of himself. His hand trembled as he set down the mug. "No," I said quietly. "I didn't give you shame. I gave you truth. What you did with it is yours to live with." He blinked hard, his eyes wet, but refusing to spill. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." He stood slowly, the movement careful and unsteady. "I should go," he murmured. I didn't stop him. At the door, he turned once more. "Your mother, she still talks about that flag. Says she sees it when she prays." I met his gaze evenly. "Then she knows what it means now." He nodded, his lips tightening into something that might have been regret. "Take care of yourself, Dana." "I've been doing that for a while," I said. He hesitated, then stepped out into the rain. I watched from the doorway as he crossed the yard, shoulders bent against the wind. His truck started after a few tries, coughing like an old man. As it pulled away, the taillights disappeared into the fog. For a long while, I stood there watching the road stay empty. When I closed the door, the house felt colder than before. Ranger whined softly and pressed his head against my knee. I knelt, resting a hand on his fur. "It's over," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The next few days passed in a blur of gray skies and restless thoughts. I tried to read, to fix the fence again, to busy my hands with anything, but my mind kept circling back to that knock, to the look in his eyes when he said the word shame. 1 week later, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't stamped with a court seal or official letterhead. It was handwritten, my mother's careful script spelling my name across the front. The paper inside smelled faintly of lilacs, the same perfume she used to wear to church. "Dana, I finally watched your hearing online. I didn't have the courage before. I'm sorry we didn't see you not just that day, but all the days before it. Your father doesn't talk about it, but he keeps the newspaper clipping on the kitchen counter. He reads it every morning like it's a prayer he can't say out loud. I don't know if you can forgive us, and maybe you shouldn't. But I want you to know we understand now. You were never running away. You were standing for something we forgot to believe in. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Love, Mom. I read it twice, then folded it neatly. The words didn't sting. They just felt late, like sunlight that took too long to travel. For a long time, I sat there at the table, the letter between my hands. The ocean wind rattled the windows, the sound steady constant. I reached for a pen, pulled out a blank sheet, and began to write. Mom, I'm not who you raised. I'm who I survived becoming. That's not anger, it's truth. I can't undo what's been done, and I don't want to. The silence taught me more than your words ever could, but I hope you find peace in what's left. Tell Dad I don't hate him. He already knows the rest. Dana. I folded the letter and slid it into an envelope, but didn't address it. Some letters aren't meant to travel, they're meant to rest. I stood, walked to the cedar chest in my bedroom and lifted the lid. The folded uniform lay inside its surface, smooth, the stain faint, but still visible. Beside it, Jason's letter and the old compass rested where I'd left them. I placed my mother's letter on top, then reached for a small patch from the side pocket, a faded fabric insignia from my last deployment, the seal trident embroidered in gold. The stitching was frayed, the edges burned from heat and sand. It was the only patch Jason and I had both worn on that final mission. I laid the patch over the letter and closed the chest gently. The click of the latch echoed softly in the quiet room. Outside, the wind picked up. The last of the leaves tore free from the trees and scattered across the yard. Ranger barked once at the window, then turned in a circle before lying down, his nose tucked under his paw. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the chest. The memory of my father's voice returned, not the harsh, commanding tone I grew up with, but the broken one from that day in the kitchen. I just wanted control. You gave me shame. Maybe he was right in a way. Control is an addiction. Shame is its detox. The next morning I went out to the porch. The flag I'd raised the week before fluttered in the wind, new fabric, crisp, bright. The sunlight caught it, turning it to gold at the edges. I watched it for a while, the rhythm steady, comforting. The phone rang inside, breaking the stillness. It was Mark Hanley again. "Heard about your dad," he said. "Small town gets smaller when people talk." "You all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "He's the one who's not. You gonna see him?" I hesitated. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. Sometimes the distance is the only peace you get." He was quiet for a moment. "You did the hard part already, Reeves. The rest, whatever comes next, that's on them." "I know. You still got that sleeve unwashed?" he asked with a faint chuckle. "Always, I said." "Then you're fine," he replied. "Some truths don't need polishing." When I hung up, the house felt warmer somehow. The air smelled faintly of rain and salt. I looked at the compass on the table, the needle still pointing north. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to move. That evening, as the sun went down, I made 2 cups of coffee habit more than need. One for me, one I left on the table across from the empty chair. The steam rose and disappeared, slowly fading like old anger, finally running out of breath. The door stayed closed that night, but I didn't feel alone. Some debts are never repaid, and some forgiveness never spoken aloud. But between the silence and the coffee, I found something close enough. Maybe that was the point. Spring came early that year, soft and reluctant, like the world was testing the idea of gentleness again. The storms that had rolled through Virginia all winter finally gave way to light rain and salt air. The yard around my grandfather's old house was still rough patches of mud, bent fencing a porch that leaned ever so slightly, but the land breathed again. For the first time in years, so did I. By March, I had moved out of my rental near the coast and into the farmhouse for good. The first morning there, I woke to the sound of gulls instead of sirens, to sunlight spilling through the window where dust had once lived. The house had been quiet for so long, it felt like it was listening. I spent my days coaxing it back to life, one nail, one brush stroke at a time. I started with the porch. The boards creaked under my boots, but the rhythm was steady, reassuring. I sanded the old paint off until the wood shone pale and raw, then brushed on a new coat white. the same color my grandfather had used. Each stroke felt like erasing years of silence. The scent of fresh paint and sea air mixed together, strange but comforting. Next came the flagpole. It had leaned for years, rust creeping along its base. I spent an entire Saturday pulling it upright, digging out the foundation, setting it in fresh cement. Ranger lay in the grass nearby, watching lazily, his head tilting every time I cursed under my breath. His muzzle had gone almost entirely gray now, and his limp was more pronounced, but he was still my shadow. When I finished securing the pole, he barked once as if to approve. I hadn't raised a flag yet. Not until it felt right. Inside, I tackled the smaller repairs, the squeaky hinges, the warped door frames, the uneven floors. I worked with my sleeves rolled up, the same old scar on my arm, catching the sunlight whenever I moved. At first, I worked in silence. Then one day, without thinking, I turned on the radio. The first song that played was an old tune my grandfather used to whistle while fixing the tractor. I froze for a moment, then smiled. Maybe ghosts had better taste and timing than I'd given them credit for. Weeks passed. The house began to change. So did I. Letters started coming, handwritten envelopes thick with ink and sincerity. Some from old comrades, others from strangers who'd seen the story online. They wrote about pride, regret, forgiveness. One woman from Illinois said her son had re-enlisted after watching my hearing. Another, a teacher from Texas, said she played the courtroom clip to her students during Veterans Week. One letter stood out. It was from a Marine sergeant I'd served with briefly in 2018. Commander Reeves, I was there in Al Raqqa, 2 blocks east of your convoy. We heard your call sign come through after the blast. Eagle 6 still standing. That's what you said. You probably don't remember, but those words carried through every radio on the grid. We all thought you were gone, but you weren't. You kept moving, and somehow that kept us moving too. Just wanted you to know some of us made it home because you refused to fall. Semper Fi. I folded that letter and kept it in the kitchen drawer beside the compass. Every so often, I'd take it out and reread it when the silence got too deep. By April, the days stretched longer. The yard began to green again. Ranger and I made a ritual of walking the perimeter at dusk. He limped beside me, steady but slower now. Sometimes I'd talk to him out loud just to fill the air. You think we did all right, old boy? He'd wag his tail faintly as if to say, You're still here, aren't you? That's enough. One afternoon, as I was repainting the shutters, a knock sounded on the porch railing. I turned, half expecting a delivery man. Instead, it was a young girl, maybe 17, wearing a school windbreaker and clutching a notebook. Commander Reeves, she asked, her voice careful but bright. That's me, I said, setting down the brush. And you are Grace Thompson. I'm a senior at Bayside High. We're doing a Memorial Day project about local veterans, and my teacher said you might talk to me. I hesitated, then nodded toward the porch chair. All right, Grace. Pull up a seat. She sat flipping open her notebook. Her hands trembled slightly. I watched your hearing online, she admitted. You were amazing. I didn't know what honor meant until that video. I smiled faintly. Neither did I back then. She looked up. Can I ask you something? What does honor mean to you now? I thought for a long time before answering. The wind rustled the trees, the smell of salt and lilac drifting through the air. Ranger shifted at my feet, resting his head on my boot. It's when the truth stops bleeding, I said finally, but you keep wearing it anyway. She wrote that down slowly, each word deliberate, like she wanted to remember it long after the ink dried. That's beautiful, she whispered. It's earned, I said simply, and earning it costs something. She nodded, looking both inspired and a little afraid, like she understood more than she wanted to. When she left, she shook my hand firmly the way soldiers do. I watched her walk down the drive, wind tugging at her hair, and thought maybe the next generation still had a fighting chance. That evening, as the sky turned amber, I brewed coffee and sat on the porch with Ranger. The horizon burned orange and gold. The repaired flagpole stood tall against it, waiting. I ran my fingers over the folded flag in my lap, the new one I'd bought from the VFW hall. Its fabric was crisp, untouched by rain or neglect. I thought of my grandfather's words, if you take care of the wood, it'll take care of you. Maybe that applied to more than houses. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Memorial Day. The air was still cool, the world wrapped in that fragile hush that comes before sunrise. I put on a simple khaki uniform, not the dress blues. No medals, just a patch above my heart, Reeves. Ranger followed me out to the porch, his paws clicking softly on the wood. The flag waited beside the pole, folded in perfect triangles. I held it carefully, the fabric smooth under my hands. As the first sliver of light broke over the horizon, I began to raise it, slowly, deliberately. The halyard rope whispered against the metal pole, the sound steady, almost reverent. When the flag reached the top, I tied the knot tight and stepped back. The wind caught it immediately, unfurling it into color red, white, blue, bright and alive. For a moment it filled the sky. I saluted, my hand steady despite the tremor that age and memory had given me. Ranger barked once as if to punctuate the silence. "Good boy," I said softly. Neighbors began to step out of their houses, some still in pajamas, watching quietly. No applause, no cameras, just presence. A few of them placed their hands over their hearts. One older man, a Vietnam vet I'd met once at the hardware store, raised 2 fingers in a small salute. I nodded back, eyes stinging. When the ceremony ended, I lowered my arm and let the silence stretch. The flag rippled above me, proud and unbroken. The sound of it snapping in the breeze felt like breath, sharp, clean, alive. I sat on the steps afterward, coffee steaming beside me, the warmth cutting through the morning chill. The world moved slow again, birds calling, waves, distant wind threading through the grass. Inside, the cedar chest still held its treasures, the uniform, the compass, the letters. I'd thought about moving them once, maybe donating them to a museum. But some things belong where they were earned. That afternoon, Grace returned with a small gift, a framed copy of her article draft. The title read, "The Woman Who Wore the Truth." I laughed softly when I saw it. "That's quite a headline," she grinned. "You inspired half the senior class. We're doing a flag raising next week at school." I tapped the frame lightly. "Then make sure they understand this," I said. "Honor isn't about perfection. It's about standing up even when you're still bleeding inside." She nodded, her eyes bright. "We will." After she left, I set the frame on the mantel beside my grandfather's photo. In it, he was grinning in his navy blues, one arm around a little girl with pigtails. I hadn't looked at that picture in years. Now, for the first time, it didn't hurt. Ranger limped over and rested his chin on my knee. I scratched behind his ears. "You think he'd be proud?" The dog blinked, which I decided meant yes. As dusk fell, the light turned soft and forgiving. I walked out to the yard, letting the grass brush against my boots. The flag swayed gently above me, and I thought of all the people I'd lost, Jason Lewis Harper, their names whispered in the wind. I raised my coffee mug toward the horizon. "We're home," I said. The stars began to appear one by one. The ocean breathed in and out, steady and eternal. For the first time, I felt no distance between who I was and who I had become. The wounds hadn't vanished, they had simply become part of the structure, like the knots in old wood that make it stronger. Ranger sighed and lay down beside me, his head heavy on my foot. The porch light flickered on above us, glowing soft and golden. Maybe peace wasn't the absence of noise or pain. Maybe it was this, the slow rhythm of a heart that had learned to beat quietly again. I looked up at the flag one more time, catching the light as it fluttered. "You did good, old man," I whispered to my grandfather's memory. "You built something worth coming back to." And for the first time in a long, long while, the house didn't feel like it was waiting for forgiveness. It felt lived in. It felt earned. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes of betrayal, drop A in the comments. The sea outside my window looked different now. Not calmer, not wilder, just older, like it had aged alongside me. The horizon had softened in color, washed into shades of pewter and amber that seemed to hold every memory I hadn't spoken aloud. I sat by the open window with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Ranger lay at my feet, his breathing steady, the soft thud of his tail tapping every few minutes against the floor. The air smelled of salt and pine, the kind that settles deep in your chest and stays there. In the quiet of the late afternoon, I finally opened the cedar chest again. The hinges creaked like a familiar sigh. Inside, folded with military precision, lay the uniform. I ran my hand over the sleeve, the fabric rough beneath my fingers. The faint stain was still there, darkened by time, but unyielding. "That sleeve still hangs in my closet," I said quietly, half to myself, half to the ghosts that never really left. "I never washed it. Not because I'm proud of the blood, but because it reminds me that dignity leaves stains the world should see." The wind shifted, carrying the sound of the surf closer. I thought of all the years I'd spent chasing something I couldn't name. Validation, peace, forgiveness, maybe all three, and how in the end, none of it looked the way I'd imagined. Justice had come and gone, but what lingered was quieter, like the slow tide reclaiming the sand. I walked out to the porch, coffee still in hand. The sky was the color of burnished copper, streaks of gold fading into indigo. The flag on the pole caught the last of the sunlight, its edges glowing as if the fabric itself remembered every name, every sacrifice stitched into its seams. I took a seat on the steps, the wood warm beneath me. Ranger followed, lowering himself beside my chair with a heavy sigh that sounded almost human. "My father once laughed at my uniform," I said softly, watching the waves break far out in the distance. "I don't know if he'll ever understand it, but I've stopped waiting for him to." The truth of that settled deep in my bones. For most of my life, I had built my worth like a fortress, brick by brick, proof by proof, trying to be seen, trying to be heard. But somewhere between the courtroom and this quiet house by the sea, I realized I didn't need his understanding to exist. Some debts are only paid by silence. Some peace is found when you stop expecting applause. I glanced at Ranger. His fur had turned almost entirely silver now. Time had thinned him out, but his eyes still carried that same loyal steadiness. He looked up at me, head tilted, as if waiting for the next command that would never come. "You did good, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "You kept me standing when everything else fell." The wind picked up cool and sharp. I pulled my jacket tighter and watched the sun sink behind the line of the water. The horizon glowed like an ember, refusing to fade completely. Somewhere behind me, the house creaked old wood, settling into its own rhythm again. It felt alive, like the ghosts had finally agreed to rest. I thought of the letters I'd kept, the ones from my comrades, from my mother, from the strangers who said the story had changed them somehow. I hadn't written back to most of them, not because I didn't care, but because some stories don't need replies. They need continuation. A gull cried overhead, the sound sharp against the soft wash of the tide. I closed my eyes and let the sound carry me back to the desert, to the smell of smoke and metal, to Jason's voice through the static of the radio, Eagle 6 still standing. It was strange how the past could feel both distant and immediate, like light traveling through years, only to reach you when you're finally ready to see it. I took a slow breath. The air was cool now, the kind that wakes you up even as the day dies. My thoughts drifted to my father again, not the angry man from my childhood, nor the broken one who came to my door, but something in between. I wondered if he'd ever looked out his own window and thought of me. I wondered if the silence between us had changed shape in his mind the way it had in mine. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a door you walked through once. It was a path you kept sweeping clear, even when no one followed. The horizon darkened, the stars beginning to appear one by one. I leaned back in the chair, watching as the first light flickered into existence. They were faint at first, almost invisible, then stronger, stubborn against the night. The same stars I'd stared at from the desert sky halfway across the world. Funny how the sky didn't change. Only we did. I thought of Grace, the high schooler with the notebook, and her question, "What does honor mean to you?" My answer had come easily then, but now it deepened, widened. Maybe honor wasn't just about standing tall or surviving the battle. Maybe it was about what you carried afterward, the quiet choices you made when no one was watching. Maybe it was sitting here in a house rebuilt from ashes with a flag that no longer symbolized duty but peace. I smiled faintly. "You did all right, Reeves," I murmured to myself. "You made it home." The coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The bitterness was grounding familiar. Behind me, the light from the living room spilled through the window, casting soft gold across the porch. The photo of my grandfather still sat on the mantel inside beside the folded uniform and the compass that had guided generations. The needle had long since stuck true north, but I liked to think it pointed here for a reason. Home. The word no longer felt like a question. Ranger shifted, resting his head on my foot again. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, a heartbeat I could sink to. For years, I'd carried a version of myself built from fear and obedience, from proving and surviving. But now, sitting under a sky that no longer demanded courage, I felt the weight of that armor lift. I wasn't the soldier anymore. I wasn't the daughter seeking approval. I was simply Dana Reeves, woman veteran survivor, quiet keeper of truth. And that was enough. The last of the light dipped below the horizon. The ocean turned to glass. In the fading glow, the flag still fluttered gently against the pole. It was the only sound left besides the wind. I stood and walked toward it, stopping just beneath its shadow. The fabric caught the dying sun colors, muted but strong. I raised my hand to my brow one final time, not out of duty, but gratitude. For all of you who didn't come home, I whispered. For all the truths we carried, for all the ones that never got seen. The breeze lifted, carrying the words away. I imagined them finding their way to Jason, to the voices that once filled the desert air. Maybe they'd understand. Maybe they already did. When I turned back toward the house, Ranger was waiting by the door. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, patient as always. I smiled. Come on, old boy. Time to rest. Inside, I hung the jacket on the same hook by the closet. The sleeve brushed lightly against my hand as I passed. I hesitated, tracing the edge of the fabric once more. It wasn't just a uniform anymore. It was a story, a monument. I whispered to it like an old friend. We did what we could. We told the truth. Then I closed the door gently. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the smell of the sea through the open window. The flag flapped once, then settled again. And in that moment, between light and shadow, sound and stillness, I understood what peace really was. It wasn't forgiveness or fame or even justice. It was the quiet knowledge that I had stood my ground, told the truth, and survived long enough to see the world keep turning. I sat back down by the window, the same spot where the story had begun. The stars glimmered across the sky, countless and indifferent. I took one last sip of cold coffee, set the cup down, and closed my eyes. The sea whispered below. Ranger sighed. The house breathed. And for the first time, everything felt exactly as it should. If your scars tell a story, don't hide them. Let the world see what it cost to stay true. If this story hit close to home, share where you're watching from and what honor means to you. It's a strange thing telling a story like this. You don't realize how much of yourself it asks for until you reach the end. I didn't write these words for sympathy or redemption or to settle a score. I wrote them because stories like mine, stories of quiet endurance, of loyalty turned against you, of surviving not war but family, are more common than anyone wants to admit. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who should have loved you but chose to judge you instead, then you already understand what this story is really about. For some, honor is a flag on a pole or a medal in a case. For others, it's the ability to walk away from what breaks you without losing your humanity. For me, it was learning to stand still while the truth did its own work. It took years to understand that the world doesn't owe you understanding. Sometimes the victory is that you spoke at all. When I walked into that courtroom wearing my SEAL uniform, the sleeves still stained with the past, I didn't go there to win. I went there to bear witness to the cost of silence, to the price of dignity. I went there to remind myself that survival isn't cowardice and that forgiveness doesn't always require reconciliation. It only requires freedom. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, you know how deep that wound cuts. It's not just the act, it's the disbelief, the rewriting of memory, the quiet erasure of everything you built your life around. It's sitting across from someone who gave you your last name and realizing they no longer recognize your worth unless it benefits them. And yet, here's the truth that took me 41 years to learn: the opposite of betrayal isn't revenge. It's truth. Because truth outlives both the wound and the wounder. So if you're watching this from your living room in Kansas, or your porch in Florida, or your apartment in Portland, if you've been through your own kind of war, the kind no one pins a medal for, then I want you to know this. You're not invisible. The quiet dignity you carry every day, the choice to keep living when bitterness would be easier, that's what honor looks like when no one's filming. To the veterans watching, I see you. Whether your battlefield was overseas or within the walls of your own home, I know what it means to come back different, to be thanked but never understood, to stare at your reflection and wonder when exactly you stopped recognizing the person who made it home. But here's what I've learned: coming home isn't about geography. It's about honesty. It's about making peace with the pieces that didn't. To the daughters and sons who grew up under control, under silence, under fear, this part is for you. The moment you choose truth over approval, you inherit a freedom your family may never comprehend. You will lose people, yes. You will walk into rooms that once felt safe and realize they're full of ghosts. But someday, somewhere, you'll breathe without permission, and that's the day you begin again. I've received messages from people all over this country: retired teachers in Ohio, truck drivers in Montana, widows in Maine, grandfathers in Arizona, each one saying the same thing. Your story could have been mine. That's what strikes me every time. It isn't just my story. It's ours. America has always been a nation built by people who had to stand up alone before anyone stood beside them. Sometimes the battleground isn't a field or a desert, it's a dining room table. Sometimes the war isn't for freedom, but for self-respect. And when you win that war quietly without applause, you've done something no medal can measure: honor. I've come to believe isn't a word you inherit. It's a verb you live. It's not about who salutes you, it's about what you stand for when everyone walks away. It's about choosing integrity when silence would be easier and forgiveness when revenge would feel sweeter. It's about the quiet after the storm, when you look at your reflection and say, I told the truth and I'm still here. I've heard from mothers who said, I wish I'd had your courage, and from sons who whispered, I wish my father could have heard this. I've read comments from people who never served but fought their own wars in hospital rooms, in courtrooms, in the quiet spaces of survival. Every message reminds me that courage isn't uniformed, it's human. It's found in every person who refused to be silenced by shame. When I stand by that flag now, I don't see a symbol of perfection. I see contradiction, pain, pride, healing. I see every name carved into the cost of being human. And I see myself not the soldier, not the daughter, but the woman who refused to let anyone else write her story. If you've ever lost your voice and then found it again, you already know how sacred that sound is. It's not loud, it's steady, like the heartbeat that keeps time long after the gunfire stops. Maybe you're watching this at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and your thoughts won't settle. Maybe you've been carrying something heavy for years, a memory, a secret, a scar, and you don't know how to let it go. Here's my advice: don't start by forgiving others. Start by forgiving yourself for surviving the only way you knew how. The rest will follow. Sometimes I think about what I'd tell that younger version of me, the one who left home at 18, terrified and unshakable all at once. I'd tell her, you're going to bleed for things that never deserved your loyalty. You're going to be called stubborn for choosing integrity over comfort. You'll be accused of pride when you're just trying to breathe, but one day the truth will stop hurting. And on that day, you'll finally understand that peace isn't something you earn. It's something you stop fighting against. Maybe you have your own version of that blood-stained sleeve, something you've kept not because it's pretty, but because it's proof. Proof that you endured. Proof that you didn't let them bury what was sacred in you. Don't hide it. Don't sanitize it for anyone's comfort. Let the world see what it cost to stay true. I've spent years learning that redemption isn't found in courtrooms or apologies. It's found in the act of rebuilding quietly, patiently, one honest moment at a time. Every coat of paint, every sunrise, every small kindness becomes a declaration: I'm still here. I'm still standing tall. I used to think strength meant never breaking. Now I know it means breaking and still choosing gentleness after. That's the kind of courage that lasts. That's the kind of honor that doesn't need medals. So if you're listening to this, wherever you are, whoever you are, take a moment to breathe. Look around. You made it through every storm that tried to erase you. That's not luck. That's resilience. That's legacy. And if you've been silent for too long, maybe tonight's the night to speak. Not for revenge, not to win, but to free yourself from the weight of pretending you were never hurt. Because the moment you tell the truth, even to yourself, the world shifts. The ground steadies. The light finds you. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. None of us do. But I know this, the storms don't last forever, and the wounds don't define you, they remind you. They remind you that you were strong enough to bleed and still keep going. When I look at the flag outside my porch now, I see more than a symbol. I see a conversation between pain and purpose, between what was lost and what was found, between who I was and who I became. The wind catches it just right, and it ripples not as perfection, but as perseverance. So, to whoever's listening, tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what honor means to you. Maybe it's raising your kids better than you were raised. Maybe it's walking away from something that once defined you. Maybe it's forgiving someone who'll never know it. Whatever it is, share it. Because your story, yes, your story might be the light someone else needs to see the path ahead. Every scar on your heart, every tremor in your voice, every time you stood your ground when no one clapped. Those are the medals life gives the brave. Don't hide them. Wear them. The world needs to see what courage looks like without the noise. And if while you're watching this you feel that ache, the one that says, I wish I could have done it differently, remember this. You did the best you could with what you knew, and now you know better. That's what growth sounds like. That's what healing feels like. When this video ends, don't just scroll away. Take a moment. Look around your space. Maybe there's something in your life, an object, a letter, a memory that deserves to be seen differently now. Pick it up, honor it, then let it rest. And if you still feel alone, look at the comments below. You'll see people from all over New York, Oklahoma, Alberta, San Diego, each one carrying their own version of the same truth. That we're not broken for having scars. We're proof that healing happens. I'll leave you with this. Life will hand you pain, dressed as lesson betrayal disguised as clarity, and endings that feel too abrupt to be fair. But somewhere in all that noise, there's a still, steady voice whispering, stand tall. You're still you. Listen to that voice. It's the sound of your soul remembering its worth. This isn't just my story. It's a mirror. And if you saw yourself somewhere in these words, if a line made your chest tighten or your eyes sting, then this story was meant for you. Don't let the world tell you your wounds disqualify you. They're the evidence that you've lived with integrity in a world that rewards pretense. And as you go about your day, wherever you are, whether you're a veteran, a parent, a survivor, or simply someone learning to begin again, carry this thought with you. The truth you live will always speak louder than the lies that tried to silence you. So here's my final salute, not to victory, but to endurance. To everyone who's ever stood up quietly when it would have been easier to kneel. Thank you for listening. Thank you for standing. Thank you for being here. Now it's your turn. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what honor means to you. Drop A in the comments and never forget your truth matters.